Yeah. Thank you for your talk. You're welcome. Okay, thank you. In July 1938, a physician named F. Bertijn published an article in the Flemish magazine Elkerlijk, in which he painted a worrying picture of the working conditions in the Belgian ministries. Thousands of public servants, Bertijn claimed, suffered because of the unsanitary offices in which they had to spend their working days. Dr. Bertijn described this situation as follows. The air in the offices is too hot and dry. Some public servants lit cigarettes filled with nasty, black, cheap, breathtaking tobacco. Consequently, offices are often filled with a thick blue mist. The smokers experience tremendous joy in this hazy tabagie. All around the public servants, the stagnating air becomes heavier and heavier. Their brains become sleepy. They get sharp headaches. Aspirins and peppermints are delivered. One sensible, well-intending guy claims that the cold coming from the outside is to be blamed. He promises to nail up the window so that it won't be opened again during the whole winter. While it's clear that the only thing that is actually needed is simply some free, therapeutic, fresh air. For heaven's sake, just open the windows. According to Bertijn, the air and light-deprived public servants were nothing less than degenerating, both in a physical as in a moral sense. Let me quote again his 1938 article. Whenever the atmosphere cools down, the public servants are severely affected. All of them have at least caught a cold, and many of them have a flu. Hear those unfortunates coughing, sneezing, spitting and spewing on the office desks and the files, which go through numerous hands and are even skimmed through by the minister and his secretaries. The germs multiply themselves on the surfaces of the office furniture and finally affect even the last remaining healthy employees. That way, after years of weakening, a crowd of lung patients is formed. Slowly, as a result of illnesses and diverse psychological reasons, the employees develop an aversion to the office. Those poor souls cannot stand each other anymore. They become timid, suspicious, and depressed. They start longing for isolation and solitude. This is why so many public servants hide themselves behind screens, behind heaps of books and files, in order to be left alone and to escape from the sardonic looks of their colleagues, no matter whether these looks are real or imaginary. In his article, Bertijn identified two problems that were, in his opinion, strongly interrelated. On the one side, the rather poor working conditions in the offices of the ministries, and on the other side, the low morale and poor efficiency rates of the Belgian civil servants. He was not the only one in interwar Belgium who demanded attention for these issues. Time and again, a small number of high-ranked public servants, politicians and so-called administrative experts declared that the quality of the Belgian civil service was quite simply substandard for a modern industrialized nation. They believed that there were too many civil servants, that these civil servants were insufficiently educated, and that the administrative services were badly organized. Most ministries, these critics asserted, had indistinctly demarcated competences, while in most offices no use was made of modern devices and techniques such as stenography, calculating machines, or even typewriters. So we're now talking about the 1930s. But in fact, even these complaints weren't new. Already in mid-19th century Belgium, critiques were being heard about a seemingly unbridled rise in the number of public servants. The liberal senator Ferdinand Spitaals, for example, cynically stated in 1857 that la moitié de la Belgique s'occupera à examiner et à administrer l'autre. One half of Belgium would be busy controlling and administrating the other half. Spitaals, the senator, identified a troubling side effect which went together with his situation. He said that the Belgian state lacked adequate office space for housing the newly appointed government officials. And as a consequence, ministries had to acquire numerous buildings, which were often old bourgeois residences, throughout the center of the nation's capital. This proved to be a costly operation and caused a disturbing dispersion of the administrative services. In the wake of the First World War, the bureaucratic apparatus of many Western countries, including Belgium, expanded in an even more significant way. both quantitatively as qualitatively. Often from sheer necessity, the Belgian government took up new tasks, such as the imposition of urban planning regulation, the creation of public housing, and the development of a premature social welfare system. And again, the pre-war patrimony of government buildings proved unable to absorb the augmenting demand for office space. And again, all bourgeois residences were bought or rented throughout Brussels, often at a high cost. Needless to say, these bourgeois residences didn't meet the rapidly rising standards of hygiene, comfort and technology, as is exemplified by Dr. Bertijn's description. For instance, some offices of the Ministry of Agriculture were located in an old café, in which the rinsing basin and the beer pump hadn't been removed. One of the most notorious situations could be encountered in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where more than 100 public servants had only one single toilet at their disposal. Embarrassingly, this particular toilet was also the only place foreign diplomats could use when they wanted to have some privacy for themselves. So it came as no surprise that the Belgian administrative experts deemed the Belgian administrative services to be lagging behind in comparison to other European countries, such as the Netherlands, the UK, Germany, and indeed Switzerland. For instance, Louis Vaudon, the private secretary of the King, believed in 1936 that Belgian public officials had to undertake a study trip to Switzerland to learn from Swiss administrative practices. Anyway, there was an obvious need and an urgent need for large-scale modernization of the Belgian administration in the 1930s and even the 1920s. But this modernization, it did not come easy. And this was actually a remarkable paradox, because after all, from the start of the 20th century onwards, Belgium had played an important role as an international center of expertise concerning the administrative sciences, or as it was called in French, mostly les sciences administratives. For example, the first Congrès international des sciences administratives took place in Brussels in 1910, and the Institut international des sciences administratives, founded in 1930, too was based in Brussels. But the Belgian government was very slow in tackling the often deplorable conditions matérielles in which its public servants had to work. Throughout the 1920s, the successive governments lacked the decisiveness to implement reforms towards modernization. And why was this? Because they were often considered to be too expensive. And confronted with the results of the international economical crisis of the 1930s, this situation was not durable anymore, and public criticism towards the inefficiency of the Belgian government and its administration intensified. The traditional systems of governance proved unable to soften the lamentable socio-economical climate, and extremist right-wing parties, which rejected the so-called rotten democratic system, and its alleged apathy, quickly became more influential. But moderate fractions too called for a more authoritarian system of government, and when the centre-right Catholic Prime Minister Paul van Zeeland took office in 1936, he responded for the first time to these desires by setting up a plan for a thorough administrative reform. And this plan was aimed at strengthening state power. That was the final aim, and hence at saving nothing less than democracy. In 1936, Van Zeeland appointed the young and tremendously ambitious public servant Louis Camus as commissaire royal à la réforme administrative. And here you see him behind his desk, which is the place where he was most of the time, I assume. In the years before, Camus had successfully led the diplomatic negotiations for an Anglo-Belgian commercial treaty. He was an Anglophile, and now he was asked by Van Zeeland, the Prime Minister, d'infuser un sang neuf à cette vieille bureaucratie, de l'amener à adopter des méthodes modernes et de rendre aux serviteurs de l'État la place qu'ils méritaient dans la nation. So, therefore, Van Zeeland and Camus set up a comprehensive plan for a durable rationalization, as it was called, of the Belgian state administration. Their high ambitions included a radical modernization of the bureaux of the public servants, which had to be concentrated, they believed, into a small number of huge, newly constructed office complexes. This was a radical rupture from earlier practices and policies, in which the creation of new office buildings had played only a marginal role. But now, Prime Minister van Zeeland and his socialist coalition partner Hendrik de Man, who was strongly influenced by Keynesian economical thinking, regarded high government expenditures as beneficial for the employment figure and the development of Belgian industry. The offices of Camus Commissariat Royal were located in the so-called Shell building, a brand new office complex in the center of Brussels, which you can see here. It's a current photo. And this building was erected at the beginning of the 1930s. Petrol multinational Shell put one wing of the building out to lease, and this way, Camus found himself in the remarkable company of co-tenants, such as the Institut International des Sciences Administratives, and even the famous Belgian modernist architect Henri van der Velde, who was at that time also the artistic councillor of the Belgian Ministry of Public Works. With its hyper-advanced technical equipment and its rational interior layout, the Shell building was a rare occurrence in 1930s Belgium. The architecture magazine Bâtir dedicated a whole issue to the building in 1934, and the magazine observed that the air in the building was filtered, humidified and heated according to the seasonal needs, that the office spaces were separated from each other by des cloisons susceptibles d'être déplacées chaque fois que s'imposera une répartition nouvelle. And thanks to the large number of outside windows, all employees could benefit from un maximum de lumière. Through the glazed walls, daylight could even penetrate into the internally situated corridors. And from this modernist vantage point, and I'm aware of the fact that this was a modern building, but actually the same type of building as was the Larkin building 30 years earlier. So Belgium was very slow, and I think many continental European countries. But from this modernist vantage point, Camus and his collaborators would investigate all aspects of the public service. And I believe that there is no doubt that the architectural conception of the Shell building would serve as an important source of inspiration for Camus' own proposals on the office architecture of the Belgian government. In 1937, Camus published two reports, which contained a blueprint of his administrative reforms. The first report dealt with the organization charts of the ministerial services and with the payment, promotion and recruitment of the public servants. Camus, who was heavily influenced by the example of the British civil service, proposed to introduce a so-called merit system, which implied that the employees could only advance if they performed well, and not just because they had been in service for a certain time. Further, Camus aspired to elevate the intellectual and moral level of the government employees by introducing a compulsory examination for all job candidates. Especially at the level of the higher management, he anticipated the advent of a corps où règne un esprit de dévouement à la chose publique, with public servants who could be nothing less than les piliers de l'État et les modèles du civisme. Common sense as these ideas may seem today, they weren't met with unanimous approval in 1937. Many civil servants and politicians regarded Camus' plans as too upsetting, and his first report quickly became controversial. For instance, the Flemish Catholic newspaper De Standaard claimed that Camus' suggestion to engage more civil servants with a university education was harmful for the Flemish people, as they held, on average, fewer university degrees than French-speaking Belgians did. Although many of Camus' ideas were officially adopted by the government in 1938, the execution of the enacted proposals proved to be very difficult, and it was hindered by resistance from high-ranked civil servants and ministers alike. A second report that was published by Camus in 1937 dealt exclusively with the office buildings for the central administrations. It was published in French and in Dutch. For the Royal Commissioner, a powerful and solid administration would be the result of a combination of three elements. First, drastically rationalized organization charts. Second, a corps of hard-working, intelligent and incorruptible civil servants. And third, a brand new working environment for these civil servants. Camus' report on the office buildings was written in collaboration with administrative experts, engineers and architects, among which two well-known modernist architects from the time. On the one hand, there was Jean-Jules Eggerix, who had enjoyed a certain renown as a designer of garden cities, at the beginning of the 1920s. And on the other hand, there was Raphael Verwilgen, who was the pioneer and probably the strongest advocate of the discipline of urban planning in Belgium. In his so-called Rapport sur les bâtiments des administrations centrales de l'État, Camus stated that virtually all offices that were in use by the Belgian government had to be abandoned. For reasons of historicity and representation, only a handful of 18th century buildings in the Rue de la Loi, the equivalent in Belgium of Downing Street in the UK, could be kept in use as official residences for the ministers or as offices for the ministerial cabinets. This is one of these typical buildings from the Rue de la Loi. But the majority of the other, and this is, by the way, the current residence of the Prime Minister, so it's still in use. But the majority of all other office buildings, which numbered about 160 and which were dispersed all over the Brussels city centre, here you see a map which every dot indicates an office of the Belgian Central State Administration. So all the other buildings, I mean, most of the 160 other buildings, they suffered, according to Camus, from numerous shortcomings. And on this drawing, which was published in the report, it's probably not easy to read, but he spotted the places where there were problems, and these problems were were the following. The corridors were obscure et non ariés. The courtyards were gloomy. The office windows were too small, fenêtres minima, he says. The number of toilets was insufficient. And last but not least, there were too many bureaux individuels. To go short, most office buildings were, according to Camus, vétustes, dilapidated. Moreover, their dispersion throughout the capital hampered mutual communication between the different services. And Camus described in his report how some ministries even had to deploy messengers who drove paperwork from one office to the other on a motorcycle. Logically, this situation brought about numerous inconveniences too for the public, as citizens sometimes had to spend a whole working day going from one office to the other just to obtain a certain information or a paper. And another side effect that was associated with the dispersion of the offices was a lack of surveillance of the subaltern personnel by their office managers. The absence of surveillance, Camus believed, inevitably led to laziness, negligence, idleness, and, with a beautiful euphemism, des occupations extra-administratives. A civil servant who worked alone in a personal office, concealed away from the looks of his colleagues, was simply less efficient than someone who worked in an open office or bureauzaal. Camus' critiques were in line with those that circulated among administrative experts in the 1930s. For instance, at the 6th International Conference on Administrative Sciences, which took place in 1936 in Warsaw, experts advocated the necessity to bring subaltern administrative personnel together in large collective office spaces with des parois vitrées. This development in office architecture was quite new in Belgium and had become possible thanks to developments in building construction techniques over the course of the preceding decades. For instance, Raphael Verwilgen and Jean-Jules Aigrichs, Camus' architectural counselors, recommended the construction of des bâtiments à squelettes comprenant des colonnes et des planchers, ou ourdis, sur lesquels on peut librement construire des cloisons intérieures, qui le plus souvent sont amovibles. This construction method was called a plan libéré, as was said in an earlier lecture today, and this construction method made it possible to adapt a building to the continuously evolving demands for space. After all, Aigrichs and Verwilgen noted that an administration was un organisme vivant en état constant de transformation. As has been remarked yesterday multiple times, and as the historian of architecture, Mauro Guillen, has pointed out in his book, The Taylorized Beauty of the Mechanical, many European modernist architects of the interwar era were heavily influenced by Taylorism, Fordism, and scientific management. They used these methodologies and ideologies to create, and I quote Guillen, an architectural aesthetic that was based on the idea of order and the promises of efficiency and technical virtuosity. End of quote. The longing for order and efficiency many modernists had was remarkably congruent with Camus' ambitions to transform the Belgian administrative apparatus into a modern, orderly and performant tool of governance. Interestingly, in the case of Camus' architectural counsellor Jean-Jules Eggerix, the experience of terrorism came first-hand. When Eggerix was a refugee in England during the First World War, Eggerix had worked as an engineer in an airplane factory in Coventry, and there he developed a lifelong admiration for Taylorist principles. Logically, he believed that office buildings too had to be aussi efficient qu'une usine, and this proposition was happily borrowed by Camus in his report on the office buildings. Although some administrative experts had warned throughout the 1920s and 30s that a state administration was not comparable to a factory at all, the industrial metaphor and the promises of order and efficiency it encompassed clearly proved to be too tempting for Camus and Eggerix. Now, how did the office buildings for the Belgian state that were conceived by Eggerix, Verwillige, Camus, how did they have to look like exactly? As I mentioned earlier, in their 1937 report, Camus, Eggerix and Verwillige argued in favor of a large-scale complex with interconnected buildings in the proximity of the Belgian parliament. And here you can see a drawing of the project. This modernist design was explicitly modeled after the layout of the IG Farbenhaus, which was built between 1928 and 1931 in Frankfurt by architect Hans Pulzig. Like Pulzig, Eggerix and Verwillige opted for a fan-shaped ensemble. You can't see it very well on this picture, but it's clearer on this one. So it's fan-shaped at the bottom, with different volumes that were connected that were placed diagonally on a small number of main volumes. And this ground plan provided the indispensable space for parking lots, greenery, and above all, it was the ideal disposition for un éclairage naturel intense, which was considered as une des bases de l'architecture moderne. There is few doubt that Eggerix and Verwillige had learned about the IG Farbenhaus through the German architecture magazine Bauwelt. In 1935, this periodical had issued a pre-publication of Ernst Neufert's design manual Bauentwurfslehre, which was released in a single volume in 1936. I don't know if people in this room are familiar with the book. Some of them are. It is the most sold architectural manual ever. It is still in print. It's like the 42nd print or something like that. It was for the first time published in 1936, but it has been hugely influential on architectural practices, although this is something that is rarely acknowledged by architects themselves. And many offices on, on office buildings which had appeared in Neufert's work were integrally reprinted in Camus' 1937 report, among which this ground plan of the IG Farbenhaus, and you can see the similarities with the own plan by Eggerix and Verwillige. There were also these schemes for the interior disposition of offices that were reprinted. And finally, there was this Querschnitt durch tiefen Büroraum mit erhöhtem Lichteinfall, lichttechnisch günstig geformte Decke und Glaszwischenwände ab 1,5 Meter Höhe. This was a picture from Neufert's book, and it was reprinted in Camus' report as the ideal that needed to be followed. Like Pulzig, Eggerix and Verwillige aspired to design buildings that had a certain grandeur and monumentality. However, none of these architects I mentioned regarded monumentality as a stylistic problem. As historian of architecture Franco Borsi has suggested, modernists such as Pulzig saw monumentality as a natural byproduct of any building that was state-of-the-art from a technological point of view and which fitted the client's program to the maximum. In principle, this design strategy was unrelated to the deliberately sought-after monumentalism that was such a prominent feature of the so-called modern classicist or classicist modern style, which took on in all European countries during the 1930s. You all know the Rijkskanselij by Speer, but also in Belgium you had this modern classicist architecture. This is a sketch, it was not executed, for a new royal library in the Brussels city centre from the 1930s. So these two projects are from the same epoch. But of course there were some similarities between the work of Pulsig and Eggerichs and Verwillige on the one side, and that of modern classicist architects on the other. For instance, none of them had many reserves concerning the use of, for instance, large building volumes, as is obvious, or for the use of repetitive elements in facades. You can see this here too very clearly. Now, when it came to the interior of the building, now we're getting closer to the bureau, Camus and Eggerichs and Verwillige recommended the use of vaste bureaux à cloisons vitrées de manière à permettre un contrôle effectif. All offices had to be equipped with ample cupboards, comfortable metal furniture, and a whole range of electronical and mechanical appliances such as telephone, télétype, service elevators, and pneumatic dispatch. These devices were meant to improve the communication between the personnel and the services at large, but above all, they had to reduce unnecessary movements of the employees. And here it is interesting to remark that Ernst Neufert, too, had written his design manual, Bauentwurfslehre, with the objective of reducing unnecessary movements and space. And this was a design strategy which, in the end, had to lead to savings of time and money. So here you can see Neufert calculated how much space 2 people, 3 people, walking people, spaziergang, how much space they took in space. And this was only meant to make actually the perfect building that was not too large, not too small. And the rationale behind this design strategy, which was extremely influential, was of course to reduce the waste of money, to see space and movements as functions of time, actually. Now, apart from the offices, the Belgian Cité Administrative, as this building was called, had to harbour a range of facilities such as a central library, depots, meeting and waiting rooms, garages, and a refectory. Finally, the complex had to be equipped with central heating, ventilation system, acoustical installation, and the necessary canalisation électrique pour l'éclairage artificiel, la ventilation, le nettoyage, les sonneries, le téléphone intérieur et les prises de courant. You will notice again that many of these amenities were already implemented in the American Larkin building more than 30 years earlier, but none of these amenities were available in any, I'm exaggerating, but most of them were not available in the Belgian government office of the 1930s. Now, the open office spaces, the bureauzalen, they were meant for the lower ranked civil servants, as Camus believed that these would always need more supervision than members of the higher management, even after the standards of recruitment had been raised. To go short, Camus seemed to believe that subaltern personnel was less trustworthy than the employees at the top of the administrative hierarchy. The Royal Commissioner recognized that some civil servants who were charged with brain work did need a quiet office for themselves, but he thought that the nature of their job was not unreconcilable with glazed walls. What was more, for Camus, even the offices of the high-ranked civil servants had to be equipped with cloisons vitrées. After all, these civil servants would have to be un corps où règne un esprit de dévouement à la chose publique. In other words, a real administrative elite of impeccable conduct. Logically, these high-ranked officers weren't supposed to harbor any secrets for the outside world, and at any time they were to give the right example to the subaltern personnel through the glazed windows. It is my opinion that Camus, with his proposal to accommodate all civil servants, both high and low-ranked, to accommodate them all in glazed offices, by that way he wanted to introduce a variation of the often talked about panoptical principle. Throughout the day, every employee had to be able to see his colleagues at work and vice versa, no matter which position one held in the administrative hierarchy. And for Camus, even the public had to be part of the general principle of the panoptical view. Let me quote his 1937 report again in my own translation. Services which have frequent contacts with the public have to be situated at the ground floor, in rooms with glazed counters. It is unnecessary to create the impression that the administrative work needs to be kept secret. This way, the attitude of the personnel will be improved and the confidence of the citizen will rise. It has been famously argued by Foucault that a generalized regime of surveillance automatically leads to auto-surveillance. Every individual behaves as if it could be seen at any time. And this internalized pattern of conduct has a strong disciplinary force. And it's precisely this internalized ideal behavior Camus seemed to have aimed for, similar to the way that Jeremy Bentham had developed the panoptical principle during the 19th century as an idealized layout for prison architecture, which was supposed to improve the conduct of the detainees. Of course, the Belgian Royal Commissioner didn't stand alone with these ideas during the interwar era, as has been illustrated by other talks during this conference. But however, I think Camus seemed to have been slightly exceptional because of his plea to subject all personnel to the panoptical principle, including the higher management. And this way he democratized the ideal of surveillance. High-ranked civil servants wouldn't be a privileged class in this respect anymore. With his report on the office buildings, Camus pursued nothing less than a tabula rasa. When read in combination with his other report, it becomes clear that the Royal Commissioner was striving for a total inversion of the current situation. The slovenly patchwork of dilapidated buildings, manned by undisciplined, inefficient and unmotivated employees, had to be replaced by a perfect office space, staffed with civil servants with an immaculate work ethic, be it enforced or natural, and the cité administrative, which had to be equipped with a special service des renseignements, also would have to serve the public meticulously, thanks to the use of administrative techniques. In short, not a single franc would be wasted on efficiency anymore. Throughout his report, Camus remarked that the new office complex would bring about numerous advantages for the personnel too. For instance, dedicated reading and relaxation rooms would be provided, which could be used during the lunch break between 12 and 2 o'clock. Nonetheless, Camus understood very well that his plans for a radical transformation of the working place would require a huge effort and a profound mental adaptation of the employees. Particularly, he expected fierce resistance towards his idea of open offices and collective working places. Practice, however, his report on the office buildings, in which this image appeared, was barely discussed. Not in the press, not in the parliament, and not even significantly among civil servants themselves. The Belgian government quickly accepted all of Camus' proposals and allocated the necessary funds for the elaboration of a definitive design for the Cité Administrative. Over the course of 1938 and 1939, Camus, Eggerichs and Verwilgen worked hard on these plans, but in the meantime, Camus was faced with serious opposition from politicians and civil servants who disagreed with his reforms concerning the organization charts and the recruitment and advancement of the employees. These were ideas that were elaborated in his first report. A number of ministers was very slow in implementing Camus' recommendation on these matters, and Camus complained that many politicians only paid lip service to his reforms. In 1939, he even offered his resignation to express his dissatisfaction with the political inertia, although his resignation was not accepted by the Prime Minister. I'm going to conclude. In many ways, Camus adopted a technocratical and even anti-political attitude. According to him, the administrative reforms were an objective necessity, which in the end would have to lead to an administration that was largely independent of the rapidly succeeding and often unstable governments. This way, the Royal Commissioner indeed wanted to save democracy from ruin and protect it against the intensified threat and appeal of fascism. However, it is clear that he never managed to get rid of politics. In other words, he wasn't able to turn the Belgian state apparatus into a technocracy, since this was clearly too much at odds with the established practices and traditions. The Cité Administrative, as it was conceived by Camus, Eggerichs and Verwilgen, this building, was never built. The Second World War broke off all activities of the Commissariat Royal à la Réforme Administrative, and during the war, Camus would take part in the resistance. After 1945, he said farewell to the administration and started a successful career in the financial sector, a sector in which his pleas for rationality and efficiency landed on a much more fertile soil. In the meantime, all plans for a radical reform of the Belgian administration were aborted. So that is after the Second World War. There were some small reforms, but no reforms in the way that Camus had conceived them. So I believe that Camus' Cité administrative appeared as a quasi-utopic place of grandeur, performance, order and control, in which all the frictions and subversiveness of the past would be cancelled out. Much in the same way as Jeremy Bentham's panoptic prison was conceived as a scheme, a utopic scheme for control and re-education, Camus' Cité administrative was an idealized scheme for surveillance and the enforcement of a high-minded working ethic. However, the resistance from civil servants and politicians against Camus' broad range of reform proposals illustrates that the extent to which social change could be effected top-down was highly limited in interwar Belgium, and probably even today. To paraphrase Till Heilman, who paraphrased Thomas Hay yesterday, the old established practices and mentalities triumphed while technocracy failed. There is few doubt that even if Camus had succeeded in building his Cité administrative with his open offices, it would not have functioned in the idealized way as he had conceived it. I thank you for your attention.